Berlin, early 1941. The winter air pressed cold against the windows of the Reich Chancellery. Inside, maps stretched across the walls like veins of conquest. France, Poland, the Balkans, all marked with black pins. The war machine of Nazi Germany appeared unstoppable. In the corner of the room, a junior intelligence officer from the Abwehr shuffled nervously through his notes. He carried a report that his superiors had already called unserious. Still, he was ordered to deliver it directly to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, and if possible, to Hitler himself. He cleared his throat and began to read. American industry, he said carefully, is converting automobile factories to build tanks. Chrysler Corporation is constructing an entirely new plant in the city of Detroit. Its goal is to produce armored vehicles on an assembly line, perhaps dozens every day. For a moment, silence. Then came the laughter. Göring leaned back in his chair, his medals glinting under the lamps. "Do they think tanks are toys?" he scoffed. "Perhaps they will sell them like Fords." The room joined in the laughter. One general joked, "The Americans will build tractors and paint them green." Hitler, standing by the map table, allowed himself a thin smile. "Mass production," he muttered, "belongs to weak nations. Our machines are crafted by hand with precision. A tank built by craftsmen will always defeat one built by workers." No one disagreed. But far from Berlin, in a city of smoke and snow beside the Detroit River, another kind of army was gathering. An army of engineers, welders, and mechanics. They did not wear uniforms or carry rifles. Their weapon was the wrench, their battlefield the factory floor, and they were about to prove every man in that room wrong. Only a year earlier, in December 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had stood before the American people and made a promise that many thought absurd. Europe was falling, Britain was desperate, and America's factories were still building cars. Yet Roosevelt declared that the United States would become the arsenal of democracy. He said America would build planes, ships, and tanks faster than any nation in history. And if the world needed proof that democracy could outproduce dictatorship, Detroit would deliver it. When the order came to Chrysler to stop making automobiles and start making weapons, there was disbelief even in Michigan. Car companies knew assembly lines, not armor plating. How could a company that built sedans and convertibles suddenly produce tanks heavy enough to crush concrete? But Chrysler's engineers, led by their president K.T. Keller, accepted the challenge. "If we can build cars by the thousands," Keller said, "we can build tanks the same way." They called the project the Detroit Tank Arsenal. Construction began before the blueprints were even finished. In the winter of 1940-41, thousands of workers poured into a frozen field in Warren Township, 20 miles outside Detroit. Under floodlights and snow, they poured concrete day and night. The structure that rose from that field would be unlike anything the world had seen. A mile of assembly lines beneath one roof, designed not for automobiles, but for war. German intelligence later described it as a fortress of production. By February 1941, the shell of the building stood complete. Steel beams, glass walls, and train lines running directly inside. It could house more workers than a small city. From the air, it looked like a factory built for giants. While the Wehrmacht perfected its Tiger and Panther designs in slow workshops, America was preparing to treat war like an equation, output multiplied by time. Every bolt, every track, every engine would move in rhythm like notes in a symphony of steel. When the first shipments of armor plate arrived by rail, welders began to work in shifts around the clock. Sparks showered the floor as cranes groaned overhead. The smell of oil and metal filled the air. This was not the elegance of a German assembly hall. It was chaos loud, smoky, relentless. But within that chaos lived something new, scale. By the spring of 1941, the Detroit Tank Arsenal was nearly ready to open. The first prototype tank sat at the end of the line, a blunt, ugly machine painted olive drab. Reporters were invited to see it, and one asked Keller if he truly believed America could mass-produce tanks. He smiled. "We don't believe it," he said. "We're already doing it." Thousands of miles away, the laughter in Berlin continued. Göring dismissed every intelligence report that mentioned Detroit's tank plant. Hitler's advisors insisted the Americans lacked the discipline, the training, the will. "They are soft," one memo said. "They drink Coca-Cola while our soldiers drink courage." But history was already turning. The war Germany thought it could win through precision would soon be lost through arithmetic. And inside that vast new factory, Every hammer strike was a number in an equation no ideology could ignore. By the end of the year, the arsenal's engines roared to life. The first production lines began to move. It wasn't perfect yet, parts jammed, welds cracked, machines overheated, but the rhythm had begun. Every day, the line moved faster. Every day, another tank took shape. And in the glow of those molten sparks, a quiet revolution was being born, one that would turn Detroit's workers into soldiers of steel and laughter in Berlin into silence. Winter 1940. The world was burning. France had fallen, Britain was barely holding on, and across the Atlantic, America was still pretending it could stay out of the war. Yet President Franklin D. Roosevelt could see what was coming. He understood that the oceans would not protect a free world from tyranny. Standing before microphones in Washington, his voice steady but urgent, Roosevelt made a promise that seemed impossible. We must become the great arsenal of democracy. Factories that once built automobiles, refrigerators, and radios would now forge weapons. He spoke directly to the American worker, not to soldiers, but to welders, engineers, and machinists. "We shall build to defend, not to conquer," he said. "We will make weapons faster than dictators can destroy." At first, the country didn't believe him. The United States had no standing army to speak of, and most factories had never built anything more dangerous than a car. But then Roosevelt's promise spread from words to blueprints, from blueprints to steel. No place took that challenge more personally than Detroit, the Motor City. The automobile industry had been built there on one simple idea: mass production. Every part made interchangeable, every motion efficient, every second saved another car. Now, the same idea would be used to build something the world had never seen: tanks by the thousands. In early 1941, the US government signed a contract with the Chrysler Corporation to design and build a completely new type of factory, one so large and powerful it could supply entire armies. K.T. Keller, Chrysler's president, accepted the job without hesitation. "You've built automobiles for peace," Roosevelt told him. "Now build engines for freedom." Keller gathered his engineers and said, "We'll take the automobile assembly line and we'll teach it to build armor." The plan was breathtaking. A factory capable of producing 22-ton armored vehicles faster than any nation had ever imagined. The design called for a structure more than a quarter of a mile long, with steel cranes big enough to lift an entire tank body, and rail lines leading directly from the assembly floor to the front lines of war. This would be the Detroit Tank Arsenal, the heart of the arsenal of democracy. The location was chosen just outside the city limits, in Warren Township, Michigan. When construction began in January 1941, the land was still frozen. Crews worked around the clock under floodlights, pouring concrete even as snow whipped through the wind. Workers joked that the site looked like a small city being built overnight. In truth, it was. The arsenal would have its own fire station, cafeteria, hospital, and rail yard. Steel beams rose through the ice and fog. Within weeks, the massive skeleton of the building was visible for miles. 1.25 million square feet of factory floor, a temple of American industry. It was the largest manufacturing project in the world at that time. Even before it opened, foreign observers called it the eighth wonder of the industrial world. Inside, Chrysler's engineers experimented with techniques no one had tried before. Instead of hand-fitting every bolt, they designed special jigs and tools to line up armor plates perfectly. Instead of cutting pieces one by one, they introduced stamping presses powerful enough to shape entire tank panels at once. They took the rhythm of car production, precision, repetition, timing, and applied it to war. Every piece of machinery in the arsenal was designed for speed. Conveyor belts moved steel hulls down the line like cars. Turrets were lowered into place by overhead cranes. Workers practiced until they could weld, rivet, and test components in perfect sequence. By the time America entered the war in December 1941, the arsenal of democracy was already roaring. Tens of thousands of men and women filled the factory floor. They came from farms, cities, and small towns, people who had never even seen a tank before. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Music played over loudspeakers to keep morale high. Coffee and oil filled the air. One reporter who toured the factory said it looked like a living organism made of steel and sweat. When the first tanks rolled out of the Detroit Tank Arsenal, it was proof that Roosevelt's words weren't just speeches, they were blueprints for victory. The United States was now officially the world's largest weapons producer, and Detroit had become its beating heart. Hitler's ministers, still confident in their hand-crafted Panthers and Tigers, refused to believe the reports. German intelligence sent word that America's factories were producing machines faster than any army could destroy them. But Berlin dismissed it as statistical propaganda. They had built their empire on perfection. America was building one on momentum, and that momentum was only growing. Every day, the arsenal refined its process. Every hour, it moved faster. Where once it took months to complete a single tank, now they were finishing several in a day. Roosevelt's words echoed through the halls of Washington. Democracy must be the great arsenal of the world. For us, this is the emergency as serious as war itself. And in Detroit, that emergency had become a miracle. As sparks flew and tracks clanked across the factory floor, the promise of the arsenal of democracy was being fulfilled not by generals, but by ordinary citizens. They weren't fighting with guns, they were fighting with time. And every minute they saved was another step closer to winning the war. The Detroit tank arsenal opened its doors in April 1941 with a problem no one had ever solved before. It was one thing to build cars by the thousands. Cars were light, predictable, and delicate. A tank was a fortress on treads 30 tons of steel, each plate thick enough to stop a cannon shell. Turning that into an assembly line product looked like madness. At first, nothing worked. The tools designed for automobiles broke under the weight of armor plate. Rivets snapped. Cranes stalled. When workers tried to fit tank turrets the way they would install a car roof, the steel didn't line up. "You don't build a tank the way you build a Plymouth," one foreman said. "You wrestle it into existence." K.T. Keller, Chrysler's hard-headed president, refused to slow down. "We are not waiting for perfect," he told his engineers. "We are waiting for tanks." He ordered new machinery, giant welding jigs that could hold an entire hull in mid-air, massive presses that could shape armor as easily as fenders. When someone said the metal was too thick to bend, Keller replied, "Then make the machine stronger." Slowly, the chaos found rhythm. The floor filled with the echo of hammers, the hiss of torches, the grind of tracks rolling along the line. Cranes glided overhead like mechanical vultures, lowering engines into open hulls. Sparks poured from welders' masks and showers of orange light. Outside, long trains waited to carry finished tanks east to the ports. Inside, the arsenal began to learn what speed really meant. Engineers redesigned every step of production. They broke each tank into modules. The hull, turret, suspension, and engine could all be built at once in different sections of the plant, then assembled at the end like a puzzle. Each sub-assembly moved on its own conveyor, meeting precisely timed stations where dozens of hands worked in harmony. The heart of the plant was the final line, a mile of motion where cold steel turned into a living machine. From one end came raw armor plates, from the other rolled a tank with an engine running, ready to fight. No one had ever seen anything like it. The workers adapted as quickly as the machinery. There were old toolmakers from Ohio, teenagers from rural towns, women who had never held a wrench before. They learned by doing. Mistakes were expensive, but Keller believed training was worth every lost hour. "We will teach America to build tanks," he said, "and America will never forget how." Each shift discovered tricks that saved seconds, faster weld patterns, better fitting bolts, easier ways to attach treads. Those seconds became minutes, those minutes became hours, and soon the line was moving twice as fast as when it began. By late 1941, the arsenal produced its first full series of tanks. The M3 Lee, an ungainly machine with 2 guns and too many weaknesses. It wasn't pretty, but it worked, and more importantly, it could be made fast. Engineers immediately began designing its successor, a sleeker, more reliable model called the M4 Sherman. The Sherman would become the most famous tank of the war, not because it was perfect, but because it could be built by the thousands. At every stage, Berlin insisted the reports were exaggerated. German intelligence noted that America's new plant had turned out hundreds of vehicles in a matter of months. Hitler's advisors dismissed it as propaganda, yet the numbers didn't lie. By the time America entered the war, the Detroit tank arsenal had already produced more tanks than Germany had in its first 2 years of fighting. And they were just getting started. The arsenal became a living symbol of Roosevelt's promise. Photographs of its floor showed rivers of tanks stretching into the distance, each one painted olive drab, each one a piece of democracy forged in steel. Workers posed proudly on completed vehicles, holding up signs that read, "Built in Detroit, ready for battle." Inspectors tested each tank by driving it straight off the line into a field of mud behind the plant. If it stalled, the crew fixed it on the spot and sent it back down the line for adjustments. When it passed, it was fueled, loaded, and rolled onto a rail car bound for the Atlantic coast. The factory never slept. 3 shifts rotated through every 24 hours. The day crew welded, the night crew painted, and the graveyard shift cleaned and recalibrated the machines for dawn. The glow from the arsenal's windows could be seen for miles across the Michigan countryside. A worker named Clara Anderson later said, "When you left the floor, your skin smelled like oil for 2 days. But you didn't mind. We knew every tank that left meant our boys had a better chance." By early 1942, the impossible had become routine. The arsenal turned out 1 complete tank every 30 minutes. Steel that had once been cars now thundered toward the front lines. Each hour erased another line of doubt written in Berlin. What began as an experiment had become a miracle of movement, a machine that built machines. And while the Axis still believed tanks had to be crafted like jewelry, Detroit had turned war into an equation of speed, sweat, and willpower. The impossible wasn't just being built, it was being mass-produced. When the first prototype of the M4 rolled out of the Detroit tank arsenal, it looked almost ordinary flat-sided, blunt, and boxy. But beneath that simple shell was the most important design philosophy of the entire war. Make it fast, make it simple, make it everywhere. The M4 Sherman wasn't born to win duels. It was born to win wars. Its engineers understood something that German generals didn't. Perfection doesn't win when it's outnumbered. A tank that can be built in a week will always defeat one that takes a month. So Chrysler's team built a tank that could be mass-produced, shipped, repaired, and replaced faster than the enemy could react. Every component was designed for interchangeability. The engine could be swapped in hours. The treads were standardized. Even the gun mount could fit multiple calibers, depending on which parts were available that week. The Sherman wasn't the strongest tank, but it was the most adaptable machine on Earth. When production of the M4 began in 1942, the arsenal changed overnight. The floor glowed orange from welding arcs. Armor plates moved down the line like boxcars. Dozens of engines rumbled at once, their sound merging into a steady mechanical heartbeat. Workers called the arsenal the city that never slept. At full capacity, more than 22,000 men and women filled its floor, each one part of a living rhythm that built democracy in steel. From dawn to midnight, sparks fell like rain. Cranes lowered turrets with a precision that seemed choreographed. Inspectors hammered on welds, sparks spraying across their boots. When a tank passed its final test, its engine roared to life, shaking the entire hangar. Within minutes, it was driven onto a train bound for the coast. Every 30 minutes, another M4 Sherman rolled out the doors. The Germans had laughed at that idea 2 years earlier. They weren't laughing now. In Berlin, intelligence reports grew stranger by the month. American factories were producing tanks at a rate the German War Ministry considered impossible. The reports spoke of assembly lines stretching for miles, cranes moving armor plate like toys, workers welding day and night without pause. One officer wrote in disbelief, "The enemy builds tanks as if he builds typewriters." Going through the report across the table. "Nonsense," he said. "They are exaggerating to frighten us." But the proof was arriving in North Africa. In late 1942, when the first Shermans rolled ashore with American and British forces, German soldiers were stunned. They faced tanks they had never seen before, new, fast, efficient, and seemingly endless in number. When one was destroyed, another appeared the next day. The Sherman wasn't perfect. Its armor could be pierced by a German 88mm gun, and its cannon struggled against the thick plates of the Tiger. But the Sherman's secret wasn't strength, it was momentum. Each one was a promise kept by the workers back in Detroit. Inside the arsenal, people began to understand the power of their hands. Each bolt tightened, each weld finished, each tank that left the factory meant a crew somewhere in the desert or in Europe might live to see another sunrise. Many of the workers had family overseas. Some had lost sons in combat. They worked harder, faster, as if building tanks could bring those sons home. Messages appeared scrawled in chalk on the hulls. From Detroit with love. This one's for Hitler. In that vast cathedral of noise, the factory became something sacred. By the end of 1943, production had reached its peak. More than 1,000 tanks a month rolled out of Detroit alone. Other plants across America, Fisher Body, Lima Locomotive, Press Steel joined the effort. using the same standardized parts and blueprints. Together they created a flood of Shermans that filled the ports of England and the deserts of Africa. German commanders began to call them the Swarm. They could destroy a few in battle, but new ones kept arriving faster than they could be counted. Hitler had once said no factory could build tanks like cars. Now America's tanks were coming off the line like cars. The M4 Sherman wasn't the best machine of the war, but it was the most American. It represented what the country believed in: efficiency, teamwork, and adaptability. It could fight on beaches, in deserts, through forests, and across rivers. It could be repaired in a barn, upgraded in a week, and built anywhere steel could be welded. And for every Tiger that Germany built, America built 50 Shermans. That was the difference between pride and purpose. The men in Berlin could deny the numbers, but the truth was rolling toward them, 1/2 hour at a time. In the shadow of the Detroit tank arsenal, the workers already knew what history would one day confirm. In this war, speed was power, and unity was unstoppable. While the Detroit tank arsenal thundered with motion, Germany's factories worked in silence, consumed by perfection. In Berlin, engineers drew elegant blueprints, precise, complex, beautiful. The Tiger, the Panther, the Elephant, each one a masterpiece of steel and engineering. They were fast, deadly, and thick with armor. They looked invincible on paper, and for a time they were. But perfection was slow. Each Tiger tank required 300,000 man-hours to build. Its armor had to be hand-cut, its engine hand-fitted. It took a small army of craftsmen to make just one. Every part was unique, every weld slightly different. If a Tiger broke down in the field, and many did, it couldn't simply be repaired. It had to be rebuilt. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Detroit had redefined what power meant. The M4 Sherman wasn't a masterpiece. It was a product. Standardized, simple, and reliable. A Sherman could be built in 10,000 man-hours, 30 times faster than a Tiger. When one broke down, the crew replaced a part, not the tank. America's engineers had found the secret to victory. Not beauty, but multiplication. Inside Hitler's command bunker, the reality was sinking in. Reports from the front painted a grim picture, Allied armor appearing faster than it could be destroyed. The Afrika Korps, once unstoppable, was now outnumbered and outmaneuvered. In the east, German divisions complained they were fighting against entire fleets of machines. But Hitler refused to change course. He believed the war could still be won through superiority of design. "One Tiger," he said proudly, "is worth 10 American tanks." He wasn't wrong about the math of firepower. He was wrong about the math of time. By the time Germany produced a single Tiger, the United States had already built 30 Shermans. Even inside Germany, not everyone shared the Führer's faith in complexity. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, warned Hitler repeatedly that American production was outpacing Germany by an order of magnitude. Speer urged him to simplify, to build cheaper, faster models. Hitler dismissed him. "I will not have our soldiers fight in inferior machines," he said. "We are Germans, not Americans." That sentence was the war in a nutshell. The German tanks were magnificent, but they were also fragile, expensive, and few. They ruled the battlefield for minutes, then broke down for days. They burned through fuel Germany didn't have, and when they were lost, they could not be replaced. The Sherman, by contrast, was humble and unpretentious. It was light enough to cross weak bridges, simple enough for any crew to learn, and cheap enough to replace overnight. It was the embodiment of American practicality, good enough everywhere, deadly in numbers. By 1943, German tank crews were facing a nightmare they didn't understand. In North Africa, they destroyed lines of Allied tanks only to see new ones appear over the dunes the next morning. In Italy, they ambushed a column of Shermans, only to face more before they could reload. The Tiger's gun could destroy a Sherman from a mile away, but the Tiger could not be everywhere. Shermans were. When one Sherman fell, another took its place. Then another, then 10 more. In Detroit, engineers weren't measuring tanks by kill ratios, they were measuring them by output per day. Roosevelt's advisors knew the math was simple. Quantity has a quality all its own. Every 30 minutes, the factory rolled out another argument against perfection. Every 30 minutes, another piece of democracy's arithmetic moved toward Europe. It wasn't that the Sherman was better, it was that it was enough. Germany couldn't understand how a weaker machine could keep winning. But war isn't a duel between two tanks. It's a contest between two systems. Hitler's system believed in control, hierarchy, and pride. America's system believed in flexibility, speed, and cooperation. The outcome was written before a single shot was fired. On the factory floor in Detroit, K.T. Keller was asked if he cared that German tanks were technically superior. He laughed and said, "I don't care if they're gold-plated. We'll just build more of ours." And he did. By the summer of 1944, American tank output had passed 50,000 units. The combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan wasn't even half that number. When the Allies stormed Normandy, the earth shook not just from shells, but from mathematics. Behind every soldier, behind every tank, stood the weight of an industrial machine that refused to stop. Even German soldiers began to notice the truth. Captured tank crews told interrogators, "We shoot one down, 2 more come over the hill." In one report, a German officer wrote bitterly, "We can win every battle and still lose the war. They will simply build more." And that was Hitler's greatest mistake, believing that war could still be won by craft when it was already being won by scale. Perfection had become his weakness. The age of the craftsman tank was over. The age of the assembly line had arrived. The Detroit tank arsenal never rested. Even at midnight, its walls pulsed with sound, the hiss of welders, the hammering of rivets, the deep rumble of engines being tested. From outside, it looked like a city of light in the dark Michigan winter. Inside, it was alive with people, tens of thousands of them, each fighting the war in their own way. They called it the arsenal that never sleeps. There were men too old for the front and boys too young to enlist. There were farmers who had traded plows for welding torches, and machinists who once built steering wheels now building turrets. And then there were the women, thousands of them, who stepped into jobs no one had ever let them try before. The world would later call them Rosie the Riveters. But here in Detroit, they were just workers doing what had to be done. A woman named Margaret Reiser once said, "When the first tank I helped build rolled past me, I cried. I thought, maybe that one will save somebody's son." There were thousands of stories like hers. Mothers, sisters, and daughters working side by side with husbands and brothers, all driven by the same quiet determination. Get it done. Many of them worked 12-hour shifts under harsh lights. The factory air was hot and thick with smoke. Sparks flew in every direction, the roar of engines never stopped, and the smell of oil clung to their clothes. But no one complained. Every tank that left the arsenal meant someone at the front might live another day. And it wasn't just women who made this miracle happen. Detroit's labor force was one of the most diverse in the world. Tens of thousands of African Americans migrated north from the rural South to join the war effort. Immigrants from Poland, Italy, and Greece worked alongside veterans of the Great Depression. Together, they turned Detroit into something the world had never seen: a democracy of labor, united by purpose. The Germans had built their empire on hierarchy and division. Detroit built its arsenal on cooperation and equality. When Hitler's advisors scoffed at the idea of women and minorities building tanks, the Americans simply kept welding. They didn't argue, they didn't respond, they just produced. By 1943, the arsenal employed 22,000 people, including 5,000 women and thousands of black workers. They worked on equal pay scales, a radical concept in an age of segregation. Management discovered something simple but profound. Skill had no color, and courage had no gender. The speed of production proved it. Each tank that left the line carried not just steel and rivets, but fingerprints from every corner of America. Welders carved initials into armor plates. Painters scrawled small messages before the tanks were painted over. "Take this one to Berlin," or "From Detroit with love." Workers began naming the tanks after loved ones: Betty, Freedom Bell, Iron Mike. To them, these machines were alive. At the end of every week, supervisors blew a factory whistle and read out the week's total. 110 tanks. 150 tanks. The workers would cheer, exhausted but proud. It wasn't about the number itself, it was about the meaning behind it. Every 30 minutes, another tank meant one less reason to doubt that democracy could win. Even with the long hours and the strain, morale was high. Chrysler's management played swing music through the loudspeakers during night shifts. Cafeterias served free coffee and hot meals around the clock. Posters on the walls reminded everyone of what was at stake. The faster we work, the sooner they come home. And still, Berlin didn't believe the numbers. German intelligence continued to send reports about America's impossible output: 1 tank every 30 minutes, planes every hour, ships every day. The High Command dismissed it all. Propaganda, they said. The Americans are weak. They rely on women and Negroes. The irony was devastating. The very diversity they mocked was what made the machine unstoppable. In 1943, a visiting British general toured the arsenal and was struck silent by what he saw. Miles of moving tanks, women in overalls, mechanics drenched in sweat, black and white workers side by side welding the same armor plate. When he finally spoke, he said, "Gentlemen, this is the war." He was right. In that building, America's greatest weapon wasn't steel, it was unity. Every spark that flew from a welder's torch was proof that freedom could organize itself, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they believed in the same cause. When those tanks rolled off the line, they weren't just machines. They were messages. They told the world that democracy could build faster than dictatorship could destroy. By 1944, the Detroit tank arsenal had built 2,234 tanks. That's more than the entire output of Nazi Germany in some years. And for every tank that left the arsenal, a factory worker somewhere whispered the same quiet prayer, "Let this one bring someone home." By the summer of 1944, the tanks built in Detroit were no longer just rows of machines rolling out of a factory, they were rolling across continents. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy, the rhythm of the arsenal had become the heartbeat of the Allied advance. When the first trains left Michigan, loaded with M4 Shermans strapped down like sleeping giants, few of the workers on the platform could have imagined where those tanks would end up. They were carried east to ports in New York and Baltimore, loaded onto cargo ships and sent across oceans. Each one took with it the hopes of the men and women who had built it, ordinary Americans who had turned bolts and lifted armor plates and believed that their work would reach the front in time. It did. In North Africa, 1943, the Shermans made their combat debut with the British 8th Army. The desert wind whipped against their armor, and the sand scoured their paint, but they kept moving. German soldiers, used to facing underpowered enemy tanks, found themselves staring down a formation of machines that never seemed to end. One German tank commander wrote in his diary, "We destroy one, and another appears. Then another. They move like a tide." He wasn't exaggerating. The Shermans could cross terrain the heavier German tanks couldn't. They burned less fuel, required fewer repairs, and when one broke down, Allied mechanics had it running again within hours. The German Tigers were powerful, yes, but they were also fragile. The desert heat warped their engines, the sand jammed their treads, and when they ran dry, they stayed where they stopped. The Shermans just kept coming. By 1944, the Allied invasion of Italy was in full swing. The roads into Rome were narrow and steep, the kind that broke trucks and crushed morale, but the Shermans climbed them anyway. They weren't glamorous machines. They rattled, they leaked, they overheated, but they worked. At the front, tank crews gave them nicknames like Old Faithful and Honey. They painted names on their sides, the same names that had been written on them back in Detroit. When a new Sherman arrived, men ran their hands over the hull like greeting an old friend. The tanks became extensions of the men who drove them and symbols of the people who had built them. Every 30 minutes, another one left Detroit. Every 30 minutes, another promise was kept. When the invasion of France began in June 1944, the scale of America's production finally became visible to the world. From the cliffs above Normandy, German observers saw something they had never imagined possible: an endless procession of ships unloading an endless number of tanks. More than 5,000 landing craft carried armored vehicles across the channel. By nightfall, thousands of Shermans were rolling down the beaches, engines roaring over the crash of waves. They came ashore through mud, wreckage and fire, and they didn't stop. Even when German 88mm guns punched through their armor, there was always another tank behind it, moving forward. One tank would burn, and its crew would climb into the next. The Allied strategy was simple: don't let the line stop moving. Behind every push toward Paris, behind every shattered hedgerow and liberated town, stood the math of Detroit. The Shermans weren't faster individually, but they could move as one, hundreds at a time, a single massive organism of steel and will. In the words of one British officer, "We didn't outgun the Germans, we outbuilt them." By autumn, the Shermans were everywhere. In Italy's mountains, in France's forests, across Belgium's fields, they became the shape of liberation. The tanks fought their way through villages where people cheered from windows, waving flags and crying. Farmers offered food to crews, children climbed onto the armor and laughed. To the people of Europe, the sight of a Sherman tank meant something simple and powerful: Freedom had arrived. And behind that freedom was an assembly line in Detroit, still humming through the night. Back home, factory workers gathered around radios to listen for news from the front. They didn't know which tank was theirs, but they all felt connected. Each report of an advance, each victory, was personal. One worker said, "When they said the Allies were moving forward, I thought maybe it's one of mine leading the way." In Germany, panic began to spread. Intelligence officers estimated that by late 1944, the Allies had produced 3 tanks for every one Germany could build. That number grew by the week. The factory workers of Detroit had done what Hitler had said no one could. They had turned war into a production line. Even as Allied tanks were being destroyed in battle, replacements were already crossing the Atlantic. The German High Command was forced to face an ugly truth. The war was no longer about who had the better tank, it was about who could keep building them. By the time the Shermans rolled into Paris, Hitler's laughter had long since faded. His empire was shrinking. His engineers were still sketching perfect weapons that would never be built. But America didn't need perfection anymore. It already had something better momentum. The arsenal of democracy had kept its promise. By the spring of 1945, the echo of Detroit's factory floor could be heard across the world, not as noise or machinery, but as thunder on distant roads. It rolled across Europe in the tracks of thousands of tanks, each one forged in the same rhythm. Every 30 minutes, one more heartbeat of democracy sent into war. From the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Berlin, the M4 Sherman became more than a machine. It became a symbol of endurance, of unity, of what happens when ordinary people refuse to give up. When the Allies finally crossed the Rhine, the end of Hitler's empire was already written in the numbers. America had produced over 88,000 tanks, while Germany struggled to field a fraction of that. The Detroit tank arsenal alone had built more armoured vehicles than all of Axis Europe combined. And yet, even as the Allies advanced, the workers back home didn't slow down. They didn't know the war was almost over. They just kept building one more, and one more after that. When American troops finally met German civilians in the ruins of Berlin, some captured officers admitted what their leaders never would. One colonel said, "We could not believe that a people of shopkeepers and factory girls could make so many machines. We did not understand what we were fighting." But that was Hitler's greatest blindness. He believed power came from fear and obedience from perfection and control. He never understood that real power comes from the hands of free people working together. He believed the world could be ruled by a few superior men. Detroit proved him wrong every 30 minutes. After the war, historians tried to explain how America had done it, how a nation that had no standing army in 1939 became the most powerful military-industrial force in history by 1945. The answer was simple: speed and trust. America's leaders trusted its workers. Engineers trusted mechanics. Men trusted women. Factories trusted towns. It wasn't just a system, it was a culture. The people who built the arsenal of democracy weren't ordered to obey. They were asked to believe. And they did. That faith in collective effort turned production lines into battlefields, welding torches into weapons, and the hum of machinery into the sound of freedom. When the last tanks rolled off the Detroit line, workers stood on rooftops to watch the trains carry them away. They waved, not knowing where those machines would go, or who would drive them, or which battles they would win. But they knew what they stood for. One worker, years later, said, "We didn't know their names, but we knew they needed us." That was the quiet truth of the arsenal, a war fought not just by soldiers, but by millions of hands that never held a gun. In the decades that followed, the Detroit tank arsenal became a museum of sorts, a place where rusting giants sat in silence. But their story lived on. Every modern factory that builds faster, every production line that adapts, every moment when people come together to solve the impossible, all of it carries a trace of that legacy. The lesson outlived the machines. Strength isn't in perfection, it's in motion. The Shermans were eventually replaced by newer tanks, but none ever carried the same spirit. The world had learned what happens when democracy learns to build. The idea that freedom could organize itself, that chaos could produce order, became the defining truth of the 20th century. Hitler's mistake wasn't just arrogance, it was ignorance. He didn't understand that freedom is faster than fear. He didn't understand that a factory full of equals can outwork an empire of slaves. When the war ended, the arsenal's gates finally closed. The machines stopped. The sparks died down. The whistles went silent. But for years afterward, people who had worked there said they could still hear it, that steady rhythm, Every 30 minutes, another tank. It was the sound of a country proving that speed could be strength, that unity could be armor, and that laughter in Berlin could turn into silence before the roar of engines built by ordinary people. The war that began with arrogance ended with arithmetic. One factory, one workforce, one tank every half hour until the math of freedom overwhelmed the myth of superiority. In the end, Detroit didn't just build machines. It built belief. Belief that democracy could fight and win. Belief that the power of many always defeats the pride of a few. And as those last tanks rolled through the smoke of victory, the message was clear. They said no factory could build tanks that fast. But every 30 minutes, America proved them wrong.